So, I am Rasmus Paludan, soldier of freedom, guardian of society, protector of the weak, and light of the Danes, and also journalist for the Voice of Freedom here in the United States, with one of the most established voices in the counter-jihad movement, the well-known scholar and expert on political Islam, Bill Warner. And maybe you want to start with broadening our knowledge about your background.
Well, I have a peculiar background to be doing this. I'm a scientist by training. I hold a doctorate in physics, do applied math, but although that seems to be unrelated to Islam, if you read my books, you'll discover that my scientific approach permeates my books. That is, I'm into fact-based reasoning, critical thought, and I do a lot of statistical analysis of Islamic texts, which sort of is like turning on an X-ray machine. You can see what's really inside. So my scientific background has made it very, oddly enough, a perfect platform to write about political Islam about. As a matter of fact, the very term political Islam is an example of my method, because I started my study of Islam when I was 30 years old and I'm now 77. And I determined that what I wanted to do was to make Islam easy to understand. I write for about a teenager. You don't even have to graduate from college. So one of the things I realized as I was studying the Islamic text, having previously studied Jewish text, Christian text, and Buddhist text, and Hindu text, is that it had a very strange peculiarity about it. If you listen to a Buddhist sutra, it's about how to be a better Buddhist and how the world is viewed from a Buddhist standpoint. When you read Islamic text, it's very odd. Most of it is not about Muslims at all. It's how we, the kafir, the unbelievers, to be treated. So without going into much further detail, there are three sacred texts in Islam: Quran, the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, and the Hadith, his traditions. 51% of the textual content is about you and me, not about how to be a Muslim. So I call the part of Islam that impacts us, because I'm not involved in the religion of Islam, let me assure you. Therefore, this is political in nature, not religious in nature. So I coined the term political Islam because one of the things you need to do in science is do precise naming. As a matter of fact, that's the first step. So you can see now how my background in science is a foundation for me in dealing with Islam, because I'm very much into rational thought.
Would you say that Islam is based on rational thought and on science?
Yes, but in a very peculiar way. One of the things that we study in science is that if something contradicts, something's wrong. That is, if I say that I just fell in the swimming pool on the way back coming into the house, you look at me and you go, wait a minute, your clothes are dry, you fell in the swimming pool, this is a contradiction. One of these two things is not true. All right? In Islam, it is based on dualism. So what we see is Islam is the religion of peace, that is true, but it's also the politics of jihad, that is true also. Wait a minute, these two things contradict each other. And so many scholars try to iron out which one is the one, and when I say stop right there, they're both correct, but they contradict each other. Yes, but that is Islamic logic. They both are correct at the same time.
How is that possible? How can something be a religion of peace and also be jihad? Jihad is killing non-believers, yes?
Yes. Every Muslim is to imitate Muhammad's life. Muhammad's life has two phases in his career. The early phase was peaceful. He preached the religion of Islam in Mecca for 13 years and converted about 150 people. He then was driven out of Mecca and went to Medina, where he became a politician and a jihadist. When he died 10 years later, all the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula were Muslim. So here we have two Muhammads, a peaceful Muhammad and a political killing Muhammad. Both of these are the perfect pattern of how to be a Muslim. One is perfectly correct and the other is perfectly correct. Now it turns out that the jihad Muslim is better than the Muslim who doesn't practice jihad, but they're both Muslims. So therefore it's not, a Muslim can choose to practice in a peaceful fashion or he can practice in a jihad violent fashion. And these two things do not contradict each other. Now in your mind and my mind they do, but not in the mind of a Muslim. They're simultaneously true.
Why is the jihadist Muslim better than the peaceful Muslim?
Because the Quran says so. It says that the jihadist Muslim, if when killed, will go directly to heaven, paradise, they say. Whereas all other Muslims have to suffer the punishment of the grave and the insecurity of Judgment Day. So the Quran says if you're a Muslim that practices jihad and you're killed in it, you go directly to heaven. You see the point I'm making here, is that the jihadist is better.
What if there is, I understand that you're saying that in the mind of a Muslim there's no conflict between being the peaceful one and the jihadist one. We could also call it the violent one. That would be equally correct. If we have 2 Muslims, or we have 1,000 Muslims, and maybe 500 of those are peaceful Muslims, and 500 of those are jihadist Muslims, who would actually have the power to decide what all 1,000 Muslims do?
Well, the peaceful Muslim knows that he is outranked by the jihadi Muslim. So they defer. Have you noticed something, that although most Muslims are peaceful, when there's a jihad attack in America, you don't hear the Muslims come out and say, that's wrong. They just sit quietly. So the jihadist has a higher rank, and they know that.
Okay. So if actually, the reason I'm asking this is, I do a lot of protests in Denmark, and many Muslims in Denmark, I usually call them foreign enemies, but many Muslims in Denmark that are originally from foreign countries, from Arabic countries or from Pakistan or Somalia, they come up to me and they say that what I'm saying is not true, because I'm saying that many Muslims are very violent, that they that they don't consider infidels worthy of anything, and that they actually hate Danes. And they're saying that's not true. We're very peaceful Muslims. You're talking about making Denmark a caliphate, and we don't want that. We're just very peaceful, and we would like to be left alone with our own religion. What do you think those Muslims would do if the jihad Muslims actually turn Denmark into a caliphate?
Well, they'll go along with the program, that's for sure, because their scripture says that's what should happen. Now, there's a distinction here between what Muslims say and do and what their text commands them to do. And this is true of all religions. So they're quite right when they say they're peaceful. But what you need to do, instead of listening to that, is to ask them this question. Muhammad committed 95 acts of jihad in 9 years of his life, the last 9 years. Will you condemn him for that? The question you want to ask to the peaceful Muslim is to choose something about the Quran or Muhammad and say, will you condemn that?
And they would never do that.
Well, now you've put them in a corner. They say, we're the peaceful Muslim, but we will not condemn violence. Not if it's condemning Muhammad's violence. I always bring all the arguments back to Muhammad. I don't deal, let's say you have 2 Muslims, and they say, well, Islam is this, Islam is that. But it contradicts what Muhammad says. So who's right? The Muslim in front of you or Muhammad?
Muhammad is always right.
Muhammad is always right.
Okay. So now this is just my interpretation, and you'll correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but the way you're describing it, the political Islam is the jihadist Islam. That's the jihadist Muslim is the political Muslim. And then the other Muslim, the peaceful Muslim, is the non-political Muslim. But they're both Muslims.
Yes.
So isn't it true that political Islam is Islam?
It is. It's half of it. Here's the other thing. See, people say Islam is a religion. No, it's mostly a political system. This gets back to precise naming. That is, I don't care about the religion of Islam. After you die, I hope you do whatever is best. I don't deal with that at all. A Muslim, however, in his practices the religion of Islam in order to avoid hell and go to paradise. So whatever you want to do, it has to include both of them. Now, it's the political part that I'm concerned about, because it's the political part that's changing the textbooks in America. We need to deal with the term jihad, by the way. Let's do a sidebar here. There are many forms of jihad. The least dangerous form of jihad is the violent jihad. That's the least dangerous, because it attracts attention. For instance, what happened in 9/11, September 11, 2001? A violent jihad, but it woke up America. So there's a form of jihad which is far more powerful, is the jihad of speech, the jihad of writing, and the jihad of money. Then there's the jihad of the sword. The sword is violent and attracts attention, but the other work is like termites in the foundation of your civilization, chewing away, lowering the resistance, saying, well, no, you can't talk about Muslims like that because they are offended. But it's true. That's okay. You can't talk about that. So the reason I bring this up is in America we're seeing that Muslims are beginning to shift the discussion that if you offend Muslims, then that's Islamophobia. But it's true. You cannot offend Muslims. What's more important than facts is feelings.
Right. Okay. Well, in Denmark, I did a protest a few months ago, and I said, I just want to remind you that the Prophet Muhammad was actually a pedophile because, at least according to our standards, because he had sex with a 10-year-old girl. So according to our terminology, that would be pedophilia. Not sure what it was then, but I know what it would be now. Mm-hmm. And then the Muslim who was there, first of all, he didn't speak very well Danish, but be that as it may, he didn't respond, that's not true. He responded, you must not talk about the Prophet.
Right.
So what does that mean?
Well, under Sharia, slander, now let me deal with America. In America, slander is me saying something about you that's false and demeans your character. Not in Islam. Slander in Islam is saying something that a Muslim does not like.
And there are many things a Muslim does not like.
Right. And so you can't talk about what he does not like. Now what's scary to me is my next video I'm going to make is there's a governmental group in England which is advancing the idea that if a Muslim doesn't like it, then that is Islamophobia and that should be a crime. So what we see here, this is far more dangerous. That is, clamping down on free speech is far more dangerous than 6 people being killed at a Christmas fair in Germany. Let me immediately say I am not demeaning the suffering of the people who are killed in jihad or the suffering of their families and their loved ones. But I am saying that in terms of the civilization, the number of people killed in America in violent jihad is far fewer than those who were killed by drunk driving. We can live as a nation killing people with drunk driving, but we cannot live in a nation in which the foundations are being eroded away. That is the concept of what is slander, for instance. That's far more dangerous. The biggest political trend that I see that is really worrying to me is the reduced use of critical thought. That is, the idea is, well, no one should be offended. Well, I'm offended. Oh, wait a minute, you're not on the list of people who can be offended. So freedom of speech is the foundation, I think, of any civilization. That is, you have an idea, let's talk about it, let's debate about it. Let's not call names, let's not get angry, let's use rational thought, fact-based reasoning. But what we're seeing more and more is that the apologists for Islam are willing to implement the Islamic slander laws by saying, we can say anything you want, but you can't offend Muslims. And by the way, on the thing about Islam as a pedophile, here's the way I speak about such things. I do not call Muhammad a pedophile. What I say is, according to Bukhari in the Hadith, Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 and consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old. Stop. I don't go any further. I find that everyone draws exactly the same conclusion. This keeps me a little out of trouble because if you never talk about individual Muslims, then you can't be sued for slander, you can't be sued for libel, and in general you're free of personal lawsuits, lawsuits that say you demeaned me or condemned or made me look bad. I don't discuss Muslims. I only discuss Muhammad, and I don't pass judgment on Muhammad. For instance, when I gave you the thing that there were 95 acts of jihad in the last 9 years of his life, did I say that was bad?
No.
I just said it is. So this keeps me, I can walk right up to the edge, but I never go over. And I recommend this to people because let the audience draw their own conclusion, which they will do.
And that's all fine, but the question is, do you do this because you think it's the rhetorically more wise choice, or do you do it because you want to guard yourself, protect yourself from being sued and being harassed and so forth? Because if it's the first choice, it's fine, but if it's because of the second reason, that might not be so good.
I think what we need to use here is a term I call skillful means. And that's what I try to do. I try to be skillful. I mean, I've been speaking on this subject since 2006. I have lots of videos. I've done many, many interviews. I've written I don't know how many newsletters and how many books. And I use this rule of never condemning Muslims because I need to persuade one more person. And if people are sensitive about a minority, which is called a race, What a strange thing to say. But that way I also am speaking to the apologists when I do this. Because I want them to see that, like, they can't push back on saying he was a pedophile. It's just like they're left with this fact. Married her at 6? What? Consummated the marriage at 9? What? But I don't draw any conclusions. It's my method.
I understand. And that method is actually, most people would think, I guess, that method would be more persuading to people than actually calling him something based on his...
Let them draw their own conclusions.
Yes.
The facts, they're there.
In Denmark, we've experienced a great change in the past 20 years with the influx of Muslims and the birth of many Muslims by Muslims in Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what you're talking about. But basically, there are two things. There is a whole different concept of freedom of speech. To me, freedom of speech is a cornerstone of democracy. You cannot have democracy without freedom of speech. That doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
But there's also something else, because just as freedom of association, freedom of speech, and so forth is a cornerstone of democracy and a right you have, there is another thing with that, which is a right you don't have. And the right you don't have in democracy, as far as I can tell, is the right not to be offended. That right you don't have.
I agree with you.
Or said another way, actually in most democracies, you would have a guarantee to be offended. Someone will say something that you don't like, to a degree that you will guarantee that you're offended, more or less.
Happens every day.
Yes. And so, isn't it true that concept, which is just the basic premise of democracy, would be very alien to a Muslim?
Very alien. Because you're not allowed to blaspheme. And blaspheming is saying something about Muhammad that is not flattering to him. So yes, it is. By the way, when I was I'm an old man now, but when I was raised as a child, I was raised to be tough. That is, people are going to say things you don't like. You can react in a way that's measured, but you don't have to get offended. If you call me a dirty son of a bitch, I'm just going to look at you and kind of smile and laugh, because I'm actually not dirty and I'm not the son of a bitch. So therefore your insult is like water off a duck's back to me. So I'm tough. And yet today we seem to be raising people who are all looking for a reason to be offended. It's a painful life.
This is very interesting, because it seems to me like the millennials and the snowflakes and what you call the younger people, those that are teenagers now or in their early 20s,
Mm-hmm.
they have a lot of focus on how they can tell other people that they've been offended by something.
Yes.
And this is unfortunate, but in fact it looks like that is similar to Muslims, because when I protest in Denmark, they say things to me that is obviously to them would be a great insult, like "you son of a bitch," your father. I'm not sure what that is even. How is that anything? Your father. But this is something that matters a lot to them. But it seems to me, first of all, it shows that they have a very different concept of what is an insult and how to react to it. Because obviously we've seen that they react very violently when I say something they don't like to hear. But also, it seems they don't understand that what they're saying doesn't really hurt me, because, as you say, I know that's not true, so why should I care?
Right.
And how is it that you in a society, grow up in a society, and still be so completely alien to the most basic thought processes of the majority of that society? Do you have an explanation for this?
Well, Muhammad did not tolerate anybody disagreeing with him. Who's the perfect Muslim? There are 89 verses in the Quran which say that every Muslim is to pattern their life after Muhammad. We know many things about Muhammad. Number one, he laughed at cruelty. There's this thing in which, at the Battle of Badr, in which a man is shot, and when he falls off his horse or camel, you can see his privates. Muhammad thought that was a hoot. Okay? He had people killed if they wrote a poem about him he didn't like. Now think about what I just told you. You write a poem about Muhammad he didn't like, he had you assassinated. He was prone to anger. There is a hadith in which is mentioned Muhammad became so angry his face was red. By the way, do you notice that tells us something about Muhammad's skin color? He was very light in skin tone because his face got red when he became angry. So here we have the leader of Islam. Becomes easily angry. He has people killed if he doesn't like what they said. And you cannot offend the man. Now translate that to Denmark, to a 19-year-old Muslim, and that's his ideal. Do you see how his reactions to you could be filled with anger and hatred?
Well, certainly what you described, which I would call, for a Dane, that would be unwanted personality traits.
Yes,
very much.
Same here.
And it would be for most of Western civilized people, I'm
yes.
sure, and they would also be counterproductive in the endeavor to move up in society. That wouldn't work very well at all. But it certainly describes many Muslims that I've met in Denmark very well. And also the fact that you didn't mention that much, but the fact that Muhammad laughed at somebody who was being demeaned or hurt. You described it as Muhammad had a penchant for cruelty. He liked cruelty. That was, he had a humorous pleasure at someone being ridiculed or something.
This is true.
This is something that is very common in Denmark. So the explanation, as I get it from you, is this is on purpose. This is what they strive to be, because that was what Muhammad was.
Exactly. Everything about Islam that you like or don't like all goes back to Muhammad. Let's go back to the Quran, the Sirah, the Hadith. Let's talk about something. Most people think that Islam is found in the Quran. But if you total up all the words in Quran, Sirah, Hadith, that is the traditions, his biography, and the Quran, you'll discover that the Quran is only 14% of the textual doctrine. So Islam is this much Allah and this much Muhammad. Do you follow my logic?
Yes.
Well, here's some good news about that. Most people consider Islam very difficult to learn about. But wait a minute, you're telling me that you can't read the biography of a man and understand it? There's nothing hard about a biography. Or his traditions, which are little short quips and sayings. War is deceit. That's the shortest hadith tradition. So, but you can understand that when I say that. So the bulk of Islam is very easy to understand. You study Muhammad. And I always refer to Muhammad much more than I do the Quran. Because like I say, everyone can understand Muhammad. So when someone says to me they don't understand Islam, I say read the biography of Muhammad and you will understand Islam. Skip the Quran.
So in fact, when Muslims ask me, have you read the Quran? And I say yes, that doesn't really matter that much, because they should be asking me, have you read the life of Muhammad? Have you read the traditions?
Yes. But they love to, and I've read them, I think I've read the Quran cover to cover 10 times. Once you crack the code of the Quran, it's an amusing book. But it does not, what I say to Muslims is that the Quran is a derivative text. That is, you can see where bits and pieces were put together like a patchwork quilt. And by the way, the Qurans that I sell can be easily understood because I take the Quran, put the verses in the right order, collect all the similar subjects. For instance, the story of Moses is told 38 times. Do you notice how many numbers I keep coming up with? So, therefore, it is easy to understand Islam. Just understand Muhammad and skip the Quran.
So, in fact, you just want to learn everything you can about the life of Muhammad, and then you will understand Islam.
Exactly.
So this leads me to a peculiar question, but now you mentioned many times that for a Muslim, Muhammad is a perfect human being. So the greatest thing you can do as a Muslim is to strive to be like Muhammad. Are they supposed to marry 6-year-olds?
That is an option. Muhammad married 11 different women, or 12, it's not real sure, one of which was a child, and others were in their middle ages. So therefore, you can choose. Muhammad gives you a broad choice to choose from. You can lead a peaceful religious life, or you can lead the life of a political jihadist.
But if you decide as a Muslim to marry a 6-year-old girl and consummate the marriage when she's 9, and you live in a country where that's not allowed, that would be most countries in the world, what would the reaction of your fellow Muslims there be? Wouldn't they say, you're breaking the rules of this country, so you're a bad Muslim.
Well, now we get into a question of whose laws we're going to obey. In the United States Constitution, Article 6 says is that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. Muslims say, that's not true. The highest law of any land is Allah's law, not your man-made law. So therefore, which law is a Muslim to abide by? So they work out of their own compromise. Now, by the way, to talk about what Muslims do and think is a very difficult process. I call that Muslimology, the study of Muslims. Why? There's 1.7 billion Muslims. So when you ask a Muslim about what Islam is, or what's the Islamic life to lead, you get a different answer from one to the other. So again, I don't care what a Muslim says. There's only one Muslim I care about, and that is Muhammad. What a Muslim does in Denmark is another thing. He may choose. Look, when I was in Kosovo one time on a trip in the Balkans, which dealt with Islam, well, I'd been told that Kosovo was over 90% Muslim. And yet I could go into any shop and buy a pizza with pork sausage on it. I could buy gambling tickets and get me a beer. Well, that must be Islam, right? That is not Islam. That is not being practiced, but yet they're nominal Muslims. So I asked someone from Kosovo, I said, what's the deal here? He said, he said, most of the Muslims in this country have never been to the mosque. Their grandfather was a Muslim. And he says, no one goes to the mosque, but he says, don't take any heart in this, because there are new mosques being built now by the Saudis, and they're filled with young men who are being taught the doctrine of jihad. The point I'm making here is that there's all kinds of Muslims. So therefore, I never judge Islam for what a Muslim does. Because being a Muslim doesn't mean you can eat pizza with pepperoni, gamble at the table, and drink a beer with it, even though there are Muslims who do that.
Yes, I understand. So in Denmark, of course, we have a constitution in Denmark as well. We have laws passed by parliament and such. And there was a study, I think it was 86% of Muslims in Denmark that said that if they had to choose to obey Danish law or Sharia, they would have to obey Sharia.
No.
Is this the correct interpretation of Islam?
Well, look, you've got man's law and you've got God's law, which is the higher law.
This worries me a bit because
it worries me a lot.
If this is the case, isn't it true that there are quite a few sections of Sharia that are not very beneficial to non-Muslims, to the kafir?
You got that straight.
Could you tell me a bit about this? Because I'm very interested. If 86% of Muslims in Denmark want to obey Sharia, I want to know what exactly they want to obey that will be not beneficial to Danes.
Well, let's start with an ethical principle. We smile at your face with hate in our heart.
Oh, so that's a rule they follow.
Yes. There's also something called sacred hate. And then there's a concept called sacred deceit. We don't have that rule. And yet they do. So what we have here is that the kafir, K-A-F-I-R, which is the term that I use because that's the term used inside of Islamic text. Now, by the way, drives Muslims crazy when I use that word, because that's their secret dirty word.
It's been used about me many times, I can tell you that.
And me as well. You're a filthy kafir. Kafir Hodges. So the Sharia, God's law, says that the kafir is to be, his function inside of Islamic society is to be a dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. The dhimmi is subjugated, the dhimmi is humiliated, the dhimmi has to pay special money in order to keep his life together, and the Christians can go to their church, but they have to pay a special tax, and the Jews can go to their synagogue, but they have to pay a special tax. They can't serve in the military, they can't own weapons, they're to step off the curb if a Muslim is approaching. If Christians are dhimmis, if they're sitting in a room and there's no empty chair and a Muslim walks into the room, one of them is to stand up and give them the chair. This is the proper role of the dhimmi.
So this is an apartheid, really, with one class the masters and one class the slaves.
Yes. Now, oddly enough, Muslims call themselves the slave of Allah. Abdullah, slave of Allah. That's what that name means. So for them, slavery is a slightly different concept. For them, perfect freedom is total slavery to the Sharia. You don't even think about it. You just do what it says. And what it says is that you and I are to be subjugated, humiliated, abused. Our women can be raped, because we need to deal with this. Rape is part of Islamic jihad doctrine. Why? Muhammad participated in rape. He gave rules on rape.
What were the rules?
Don't have sex with them if they're having their period. Don't have sex with them if they're pregnant. But you have to capture them. That's one of the rules. So now, jihad can be practiced by large armies like Islamic State, but jihad can also be practiced by one person. So if a Muslim makes a kafir woman his subject, that is, by physically restraining her, she's now those whom his right arm possesses. That's the term of the
I understand.
Quran.
So in fact, if a 19-year-old Muslim in Denmark were to rape a Danish female that he met on the street, that would be a violation of Danish law, but it would be in complete obedience of Islamic law.
Precisely.
Right. Okay. And so 86% of Muslims in Denmark wants to obey the Sharia.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that they want to rape the Danish females, I guess.
No, it does not. It is an ethical option that is open.
Right.
You don't have to do it. It's not mandatory, but it is an option which is available. It is allowed.
What about, you said that dhimmis, which would be, dhimmis are non-believers and Christians and Jews, all the people that are not Muslim really, they are to be humiliated and abused.
Yes.
Does he give any guidance on how this is going to happen?
No, this all stems from a Quran and a verse in Surah 9, I think it's chapter 24, but I'm not real sure on that, in which it says that the people of the book, which is what the Jews and Christians are, to fight to them until there is no more fitna, that is, no more chaos, that is, there's no resistance to the doctrine of Islam. They're subjugated and humiliated, and they pay the poll tax, the jizya tax. So this comes from one verse in the Quran. Now, one of the oddities about the Quran is if it contains contradictory information, the latter information is better than the earlier information. So therefore, Surah 9 is the last chapter of the Quran. So therefore, it is the latest word from Allah. So when that says that there is jihad to be practiced against the non-believer, then that means that trumps all the previous peaceful work.
So in fact, when Muslims say that there are very peaceful verses in the Quran,
There are.
maybe that's not so truthful when the latter are not so peaceful.
Well, they tell you half the truth. In American court of law, and I've been an expert witness in a court of law, you have to swear to do two things: to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So half-truths are gone when you tell the whole truth. So in our system of law, a half-truth is the same as a lie. And I would say the same is true when you're dealing with a Muslim. He only gives you half the truth, because he chooses not to give you the rest. War is deceit.
But isn't it true that that's also, as you just mentioned before, he is supposed to be deceitful against the non-believers?
Yes.
So actually, that's something that he's obligated to do.
Yes, this is true. Do you see how our civilization has two key foundational stones: critical thought and what Christians call the golden rule, what I call the unitary ethical rule.
Do unto others.
Which others? All others. Islam is not like that. It has a set of beliefs, an ethical set of principles for the believer and one for the non-believer.
Yes, okay.
And by the way, there's one more thing. This is the fact that I find the one I like least in the Quran. There are 12 verses in the Quran which say that a Muslim is never the real friend of a kafir, an unbeliever. Now think about what that just said. This means you're your next door neighbor. If they're a Muslim, the book which is Allah's law, the Quran, okay, says that you can be friendly with a kafir, but never his real friend. You must always, that is, if you're a Muslim boss and you have a Christian who's working for you and a Muslim who's working for you, which one gets promoted?
Always the Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
So, if this is true, I just want to understand, because there are so many Muslims in Denmark that say that since they have a job and they pay taxes, they're fully integrated, and they should just be allowed to practice their faith, because that's the freedom of Danish society, that you're allowed to have freedom of religion. Is this really something that would work in the long term, that if every Muslim is allowed to just practice their faith, provided they have a job, then Denmark will be fine? Could you make a prognosis here?
Let's go back in history. Let's look at history. Turkey used to be Christian. Egypt used to be Christian. Pakistan used to be Hindu. Afghanistan used to be Buddhist. North Africa used to be Christian. Where are those countries now?
They're all Muslim.
Yes. It's what I call the law of saturation. How long did it take for Anatolia, Asia Minor, or Turkey to become Muslim? It took centuries. Centuries. So Islam is never in a hurry. Right now we're satisfied with this small bit, but it will grow. Because over time, history teaches this fact. Unless Muslims are driven out by force, once they set up camp in your country, over enough period of time, that country will become 100% Muslim. That's what history teaches us. And yet, in America, this history is not taught in the schools. This history is not taught in the churches. This history is not taught by the Jews.
Why is that?
Now you've asked the most difficult question of the interview. When I see what the doctrine of Islam says, which is, I can be hated, I can be killed, I can be demeaned, I go, I don't like that. And when I'm dealing with someone who is anybody, I'll ask them difficult questions sometimes. These same peaceful Muslims, which you're talking about, do not allow difficult questions to be asked, or you'll see another side of them. So, Muhammad, remember, started out his career as a peaceful Muslim, but he ended it as a political jihadist. So when we're dealing with Islam, we need to realize that it represents a process. That is, if you're a Muslim and I come to you and I say, I'm interested in Islam, he won't tell me that Muhammad was killing Kafirs. He's going to tell you about the beautiful religion and what the beautiful community, the Ummah, is. He's going to sell you the Islam of Mecca. He's not going to sell you the Islam of Medina. So you're going to get the good part, and they're not going to tell you. It is a gradual revelation.
But you just said earlier that Medina was actually the latest in life of Muhammad.
Yes.
And you also said that whatever comes later, it takes precedence over what came earlier.
What the Quran says is not that the earlier is false, but the latter is better and stronger.
So Medina is better and stronger.
Yes, but the early one is still true. Do you see here how the logic of Islam is like to us? And yet that's the way it works. It makes them very powerful.
It makes it easy to, I wouldn't say lie, but in fact lie, because you're choosing which contradictory truth you're telling.
Exactly. So it makes them very powerful. If they're dealing with someone to convert them to Islam who is a peaceful person, they can preach that part. But if you're dealing in prison and you're trying to convert a man to Islam who's already a murderer, you can emphasize the latter part. Whatever you need. So Islam is like this buffet table. You can go and pick off of it what you want.
It's no secret that I and my followers are fighting very intensely in Denmark to make sure that there is not a single Muslim on Danish soil, though obviously that's not something that can happen overnight, unfortunately. At what point would you say that the percentage of Muslims in a Western country is so high that it would be a real threat to the continued civilization that country originally had?
The figure appears to be about 10%. I noticed that in France, that one of the military or high-level law enforcement said, if riots break out and they're big riots, we can't control them. So France is already saying we're getting to the point where to push back is going to be very, very difficult. Now, Macron and Merkel and May don't seem to care. The hardest thing for me to explain about Islam is how people react to it. And yet, Merkel can't do enough for the Muslims. It's possible that one day she'll step out with a hijab on. I'm sure she's tried one on in special circumstances. I simply do not understand her. As a matter of fact, I've coined a rule which I use, which is the higher you go, the less they know. Because I noticed something. If you go to a church, the people sitting in the pews know about Islam, but the man behind the pulpit doesn't. If you're talking to military people, The gunny sergeant from Afghanistan knows a lot about Islam, but the current head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff knows nothing. And so it appears that the higher you go, the less they know, which means that in Denmark the same is true, or in France the same is true. They're beginning to see an erosion of their own sovereign power, and so what do they choose to do? They go, well, sovereignty is not a good thing anyway. That's just that evil nationalism. So they're beginning to backpedal and try to give themselves some ideological room for being abject, ignorant cowards.
I don't have an insight into the thoughts of Chancellor Merkel. Certainly I don't, and I think it would be troubling for me if I did, probably.
Probably would.
but there is something that's generally true for many of the leaders you're mentioning, and I see this in Denmark as well, and that's the concept that I hear this often when I criticize behavior by Muslims. Either I get whataboutism, which is you just offended Muslims, they react with violence. If you offend a Danish gang member, he would react with violence as well. That's one thing. But the other thing is you shouldn't offend them and treat them badly because they're humans just like you. And if that is the concept you have of people, that everybody is like yourself, that is, if you're a Western European with great love for democracy and freedom of speech, and you have the concept that everybody is like that, then obviously why not welcome Muslims? But as far as I can tell from what you're saying, that would not be the case. I mean, Muslims coming in would not be like me, would they?
Well, they have a different ethical system. Let's go back to the Golden Rule. The Buddhists observe the Golden Rule. Christians observe the Golden Rule. Jews observe the Golden Rule. And I have many friends who are atheists and they observe the Golden Rule. So if you're dealing with one group of people who go by the Golden Rule and another group of people who say, no, we smile at your face with hate in our heart, do these two people really make a strong society? Because one, also the kafir is always inferior to the Muslim. So it's funny, they want to talk about me, they say I'm a racist, and yet when Muslims say he is inferior to us, they're like, oh, well, that's just Islam.
But
how do you really mean that?
How can you be a racist when Muslims are not a race?
There's a good reason. Let me tell you the reason. It's a dirty word. And so it's just a word they can smear you with. It has nothing like, if I call you a son of a bitch, I really don't mean that you came out of the uterus of a dog. Okay? But it's just an insult. And that's all that it is.
But for a Western European, or for descendants of Western Europeans, that would be Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and so forth, the concept of saying something slanderous and untrue about a fellow citizen would demean yourself in your own eyes, as well in the eyes of others.
Let me give you another example. Let's say you and I start having an argument and I start shouting and screaming at you. To other people who are Americans, they would go, Bill, you just lost the argument. When you blow your cool like that and start screaming and yelling, you've lost the argument. But for a Muslim, he's won the argument.
I see this often in Denmark, that they're yelling and screaming, and I'm standing completely relaxed, and they're yelling and screaming, and I'm completely silent, just looking at them.
Right.
But how is this possible how can they have this perception? Because, as you say, as a Dane, if the other party of the argument, if he's very threatening and violent and loses his cool completely, then I can just step back and say, okay, well, that was that. I mean,
right.
Obviously, no arguments from that side, so I won.
Right, exactly. You've shown your ass, so you lose. But not so in Islam. Again, if we're trying to make a community, do you see the problem here?
Well, the problem is that there are people with different rules that have to live together.
Yes, and these rules cannot be modified. That's the other thing. Well, Islam just needs to be reformed. Well, let me point out something to those who say Islam should be reformed. The Taliban is a reform movement. The Muslim Brotherhood is a reform movement. Boko Haram is a reform movement. Al-Qaeda is a reform movement. Those are reform movements because they go back to the foundations. A reformed Islam is the last thing we want, because what you mean when you say you want to reform it, you want to take out and remove the Quran of Medina. Well, you're going to remove the only thing which brought them success. Why are they going to do that? They're not.
Why is it that the left are the biggest apologists for Islam? Why is that? Because that's not treating everybody equally and nice.
Out of theory. In America, the left wants to destroy the constitutional government we have. I mean, that's their real goal. They don't want to improve it, they want to tear it down. Because it's a colonialist, racist, whatever the current terms of slur are. They see themselves as the hammer, and they see Islam as the anvil to bring down our society. They see themselves as allies, but the left are utopians, and so therefore don't study history. Utopians have no reason to study history because they are the new Messiah. They understand it for the first time. All those old communists, they didn't really understand. Stalin didn't really understand Marxism, Mao Zedong, but today we understand it, and we're part of that select group. So therefore, they see themselves in bringing down the country, and they see the Muslims as their partners. But since they haven't studied history, they don't know that in Iran, it was the Tudor party, the left, who brought Khomeini to power, not the Muslims.
How did it go for them?
5 days later, good question, he issued death warrants for all their leaders. So the left does not realize, they think that because they're their best buddies, they don't know that the verses that say you're not really our friend exist. So the most ignorant people about Islam are the apologists for Islam.
How long will they live after the Muslims have taken power, do you think?
As soon as they're no longer useful.
Then they will be killed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's what history teaches. Now, of course, the Muslims also need somebody who was the traitor with the Nazis in Europe. There was a special name for them.
Vichy was the French.
Yes.
Was the French traitor, I guess you could say.
So you'll always find anybody comes to power.
Oh, you're thinking about the Quislings, probably.
Yes.
From Norway.
Yes.
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 I visited his grave, by the way, but that was a coincidence.
So you'll always find people who will whore it out in order to work with the new master. But by and large, they'll be taken down once Islam comes to power.
This is very interesting because I'm always thinking about, well, I am because I know the reality and I can see the birth rates and so forth and the influx of Muslims. So I'm thinking if our fight is not successful, and here is hoping that it is successful, but if it's not, I'm thinking who will be killed by the Muslims first. And, you know, I'm thinking I would be on that list, certainly, but you would be there too, I guess. But on the other hand, many Muslims, they like strength and they don't like weakness.
There's only one thing which Islamic doctrine says, that the Muslim is to respect of the kafir, overwhelming force.
Right.
And so when you do this, we'll all be nice and play together. No. Matter of fact, an Egyptian Christian said to me, he says, you now have a degree of security. He says, your death would be politically inconvenient and attract attention. And he says, the other thing is, you have one quality which all Muslims admire. You're a strong man. And they respect that.
Right. So actually, that might work for my benefit as well, security-wise. That I go out into the Muslim neighborhoods and stand there regardless and tell them that I don't like them.
They have a certain amount of respect for you.
Okay.
They do not respect those who are wobbly and try to
Ease them. Yeah, please them.
Please them and subjugate themselves to them.
This is very interesting because there was an incident a few months ago when in Denmark now they passed a law that prohibits the niqab or the burqa in public spaces.
Good.
This is illegal now. And I was in a supermarket, and as luck would have it, I actually encountered a niqab-clad female, which was very surprising considering who I am and so forth.
Right.
I said, you know, this is illegal in Denmark. Are you aware of this? And she was very angry with me. And if I don't know who she was because she was completely covered, but she knew who I was. So she said, as a lawyer, you should know that you're not allowed to film me in public spaces. And I said, well, that's not true. According to section 264A of the Penal Code, I am allowed to film you in public spaces.
Because it's a public space.
Yes, but I was following her with the camera and waiting for the police to arrive, and she said, you're doing something illegal. And I said, well, if that's your opinion, then let's stay here and wait for the police, and you can file a complaint against me.
Yes.
That's fine. I'm fine with that. She wasn't fine with that, though. So she wanted to go home, and quickly I was surrounded by around 10 male Muslims, aging, I think, 15 to 20 probably, and I was alone, and they were 10. And I kept going, and they tried to intimidate me into stopping. And I said, "No, I'm not gonna. I'm gonna follow this criminal niqab-wearing female." And then they had a discussion among themselves, which I was privy to because they were surrounding me, and they said, well, do something about this. I mean, hit him or something. And then one of them said, no, don't do that. That's what he wants. So it seems to me that there's the same thing that you just mentioned, that some of them are aware. Obviously, that's not true. I didn't want that, so that wasn't true. But I think what he meant was, if you hurt him, it may be bad for him, but it's much worse for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing. It's a show of force that they know that if they hurt a vocal, strong critic of theirs, then that will be bad for them. It would be worse for them than it would be for the person they hurt.
Exactly. And besides that, I don't know about you. I mean, when I first started out doing this, I was very nervous about it. But now then, I've done it so long that it's like someone has to do this work. By the way, let me tell you something that I found about everyone who joins the fight against political Islam. They have three qualities. They're above average intelligence because they look at the media and go, that ain't true. They're compassionate because they're, like for me, myself, I'm 77 years old. I'm going to be dead by the time Islam moves in. But I'm worried about future generations. So all people who do this work have an element of compassion. And the other thing is they're courageous. So if you join this fight, you'll meet people who are courageous, compassionate, and above average intelligence. And I've been at this a long time, and it's true with every person I meet.
This is very nice. I can tell you I've also met people with those qualities in the fight, and that's a very important thing. But I think most people forget the second trait, actually, because the compassion they don't see. But of course, that's the reason anybody would stand up in great hardship and say things that are very unpopular and being threatened on your life. Why would you actually want to suffer all that unless you had a great love for other people?
Well, for instance, I've spoken out against the Islamic doctrine that persecutes women, female genital mutilation. I mean, and I'm appalled that the feminists in America are not on my side in opposing female genital mutilation or wife beating.
Are they in favor of these things?
They don't want to discuss it. They don't want to talk about it. As a matter of fact, they will not discuss it. Feminism, in my opinion, is a corrupt doctrine now in the United States. It simply now means if you go to college and you study business, then you should be promoted to a CEO of a corporation.
If you're a female.
If you're female. And that's the end of it. It's all about corporate advancement.
So feminism is really, as it is now in America, and I think that's for most of the world actually, it's about equality of outcome.
Yes.
But it should be about equality of opportunity.
Exactly. But anyway, I speak for Muslim women. All right. I mean, I have 2 daughters and granddaughters, and I would not want them to live under Islam and be treated in that way. For instance, wife beating is included in the Quran and the Hadith. It's part of the Sharia. I object to wife beating. Now, mind you, having been married for nearly 60 years, I can understand the impulse, but I've never done it. So I speak against Islamic wife beating, and for that I'm a bad person. What?
Yes. Well, I can tell you I'm also against beating teenagers when they're misbehaving, though I can tell you that being out at protests and having to speak with many of them, I do get the urge sometimes. So I have some questions about the Sharia that I didn't really... You told me about, the deceit and so forth and half-truth, which is basically a concept of lying,
mm-hmm.
as far as a Western European would be concerned. When we look at the Islamic State, that is no longer so much an issue because they were more or less defeated, at least territorially. Mm-hmm. But there were some videos of them throwing live males off buildings mm-hmm. because they were accused of being homosexuals.
Yes, that's hadith.
Is that what is supposed to happen with homosexuals?
It has happened, and there's a hadith about this which mentions throwing them off tall buildings. There's another punishment also which it recommends, but I don't remember that exactly. Now, you would think if they have in Sharia law killing of homosexuals, you would think that the homosexual community in Europe and America would be outraged. Not so.
Why is that?
Their lips are zipped.
Right.
People have... The Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a left-wing organization which calls itself a civil rights organization, has declared that I'm anti-Muslim, which is odd because I never speak against Muslims. We've done an interview now for a while. Have I spoken against any Muslims?
No, I have, I think.
But I have not.
No.
But I'm a anti-Muslim, racist, hater, bigot, Islamophobe. Now, what I find out is that the threat of being called a racist or a hater or a bigot or an Islamophobe is enough to make a lot of people be quiet because they don't want to be called bad names. Well, I'm called bad names on a daily basis and I'm still here. But yet there are many who are afraid to be called a bad person, a bigot. As a matter of fact, now in America, the term racist is beginning to lose its impact. Everybody's a racist. And so as a consequence, if everybody's a racist, if Charlie Brown is a racist, Bugs Bunny is a racist, and everybody's a racist, then after a while it's like, well, it's not an insult if everybody is one. So it's losing its impact. But they still like to call that name, and we've already been over this, but what race is it? I did an interview with a man who calls himself the apostate prophet. And I said, well, let me ask you this. Since you're a former Muslim, did your race change when you left Islam? He said, no. The DNA remained the same, oddly enough.
Is there any explanation as to the spread of Islam? I know it's geographically coming from the Middle East, obviously, from Medina, obviously, but how come it conquered, so to speak, the entire northern Africa, but not Europe? I mean, what is the explanation for this?
Well, let's take Spain as an example. Islam invaded Spain under Tariq in the year 711. They were finally driven out on the last day in 1492. This was 7 centuries of war. Over 200 battles were fought. So Islam was taken care of in Spain by suffering that lasted centuries. They were driven out of the Balkans for the same reason, and it took a lot of people suffering. So what we want to do is to be able to deal with Islam on an ideological level. I do not advocate violence. I do point out that after a while, a nation has only one, if Islam becomes strong enough, it only has 2 options: submit or fight and drive them out. What I want to do is for us, in 1400 years of history, there are 2 things that have never happened which are true today. One is that the doctrine of political Islam is now available to anyone who can read at a teenage level in high school. The other is the apostates of Islam are beginning to speak. This is historically a new fact. You can't look at an apostate and tell them, you don't understand Islam. Actually, they do. What Muslims say to an apostate is, oh, you don't really understand Islam, because if you understood Islam, you wouldn't have left it. But still, nevertheless, when apologists for Islam who are not Muslims don't look at an apostate and go, you don't know what you're talking about. So these are 2 weapons in an ideological war which have never been present before, and it makes me optimistic. It is possible to solve the Islamic problem simply by dealing with Islam. That is, if you work with a Muslim, that you will occasionally ask him questions about Islam, and ask him, would he condemn them? Would you condemn Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old? That is, we should engage Muslims in the field of ideas. That is our greatest strength. And so we should be doing that, and that's what I'm all about. I'm all about ideological conflict, and because I want to talk the issue out. I'm not for grabbing a gun and doing something about it that way. That is the last step.
Is there not a problem with that proposition? I'm going to ask you this. What you're saying is that if we ask Muslims critical questions about their religion, maybe they will see, that they will realize that Islam is not so great, perhaps?
This is observed in actual fact. I know of 2 Christians who are very good at converting Muslims to Christianity. What they do is they teach the Muslim all of Islam. Because you see, here's the thing. Muslims are the strangest people in the world as they're viewed from the outside. Everyone thinks that a Muslim knows everything about Islam.
But they know very little.
They know less than anyone else. Not anyone else, but they know very little about it. So what happens is these Christians who are converting Muslims they teach them all of Muhammad. They teach them all of the Quran. And they find that people don't want that. So when I say we engage a Muslim in critical thought, my idea is that many people, once they discover what the full Islam is, they go, I'm out of here. It is estimated that 1 in 5 Muslims in America is not really a practicing Muslim at all. They haven't left in a formal way, but they simply don't practice it at all anymore. That is, they just quietly disappear. So Muslims can be converted into kafirs, and the way we do that is with Muhammad. In the diamond cutting business, to cut a diamond you need a diamond. To cut Islam you need Muhammad.
So, in other words, the antidote, if it's not physical fighting, which would be the last resort, I guess, is just educating Muslims about their own religion.
It's very effective and fun.
Yes.